now we present our keynote speaker for tonight. Ryne Dionisio is an alumnus of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has organized the Filipino Americans Coming Together Conference in the past and has attended and presented several Filipino community conferences across the nation. He's also the founder of the Midwest Association of Filipino Americans and formed the Chicago team for bakitwhy.com. In 2015, he helped create the Chicago chapter of Filipino American Unity for Progress, UNIPRO, and served as chapter president.
Let's give a warm welcome to Ryne.
Woo!
Hi, everyone online. My name is Ryne Dionisio, he, him, his, and welcome again to a snowy FACT 2021, depending on where you are. I co-coordinated FACT back in 2003 when some of you were born, so it's crazy to see how a literal generation has changed, how community building and activism works since then. I wish I could be there in person. Champaign-Urbana always feels like a second home to me, but at least I can show off some visual aids that wouldn't work quite as well standing on a stage. You can now hear me okay? Okay. I can hear. Okay. Sorry, guys. Sorry, I'll keep going. So anyway, Champaign-Urbana always felt like a second home to me, but I can show off some visual aids. Right now, we're in the process of moving in my home, so I found some things like the folder for FACT, the year that I ran it. So there I am with my cool bangs. Maybe next year we can finally all meet up in person if some people would finally get their shots. But yeah, this year's theme is Lakas ng Pagsasama, Strength in Community, something that's timely, partly in response to the rise in anti-Asian sentiment over the past year. But make no mistake, this isn't some recent phenomenon. Historically, Filipino migrant workers in California in the 1920s and 30s faced signs like "No dogs and Filipinos allowed," or "Get rid of all Filipinos or we'll burn this town down," which eventually led to anti-Filipino riots. Now, that was almost a century ago, but anecdotally, while I was a student at Illinois, one of my friends came home to a note on her car telling her to go back where she came from, completely unprompted. But we can't ignore the reality and recency of the situation we're in now. Statistically, things are getting worse. The FBI published that hate crimes against Asians rose 76% in 2020. So how does community play into all of this? I've learned community is an absurdly powerful word, and one that's almost irreplaceable. If you're ever part of any kind of community serving organization and you're writing about an event or a mission statement, you'll run out of words really quickly if you want to avoid using the word community a dozen times. It just encompasses so much that close synonyms like commonality and diaspora, they lose a lot of what you might think defines a community. When I think of community in the context of Filipino Americans, it means a group of people with similar goals and values, which arise from similar upbringings or generationally shared immigration stories. I want to assure all of you listening right now that you are part of our community. Even if you don't identify as Filipino American, I still appreciate you being here this weekend to learn more about our histories and struggles, and hopefully deepening your bonds with some people. If you do identify, don't let anyone try to take that away from you. Even with my resume, I've had people tell me I'm not Filipino because I only speak English, a decision my immigrant parents made because they thought it would give me the greatest chance at success in this country. I've come to understand that they wanted what was best for their kids, but that also doesn't exclude me from being Filipino. We're all fighting many similar battles, and the last thing we need are gatekeepers bringing us down from within. But there is a difference between being a passive and an active community member. Being here at FACT, going to workshops, learning, and most importantly, sharing. That's where the power starts. That's what leads to volunteering with other community members, or joining established groups, or even starting new ones, which I'll get to shortly. Communication, then organization, then action. That's how we can battle back against the issues we've been facing lately. I don't have a silver bullet or anything, but some great progress would be if we can educate against some of the ignorance around COVID, be vocal that we will not tolerate attacks against our friends and family members, and support people who might be dealing with some newfound fears. An individual has a lot of potential, but a community can provide the support to make big things happen. Like, say, elect the first ever Asian American mayors in big cities like Cincinnati or Boston. Today, I'd like to share a kind of oral history of how just a few years ago, a community that probably all of your schools are a part of came together. Most of you are probably familiar with MAFA, the Midwest Association of Filipino Americans. It's the umbrella organization that unites the Filipino student groups across the Midwest, from Minnesota all the way to Pennsylvania, which is like a 14.5 hour drive. MAFA was formally created in 2008, but I want to take you back to a time before smartphones were a thing and we all had the internet in our pockets, and the Facebook was still called the Facebook. There was no MAFA as we know it now. Instead, MAFA was the name of a conference, similar to FACT, but in the spring. That conference is now known as the Midwest Filipino American Summit, or MFAS. So every time I say MAFA going forward, think Spring Philam Conference. Our organizations in the region didn't really collaborate much back then, other than maybe some small events here and there. FACT and MAFA were the only times we really saw each other all together at once. But there was a really specific series of events that led to the birth of the current umbrella association. And I think it's amazing that it owes its formation to multiple individual Filipino student groups seeing a need and forming a community. The 2005 Spring MAFA Conference was held at Michigan State. And to help raise money for it, their Philam organization did what any college organization would do. They threw a fundraiser at a club and they charged admission. But not a club at MSU, but at Ohio State with their Philippine Student Association. And to drum up even more interest, MSU reached out to their friends at Purdue to come, who in turn reached out to their friends at Illinois, which is where I was vice president external at the time of PSA. We were a bit hesitant at first to go, drive an hour and a half to Purdue, then another 4 hours to OSU. This wasn't a weekend long conference, it was literally just a night out. But Purdue was really insistent. The leadership there at the time were like social butterflies who I feel were seeing the big picture before anyone else. So we were eventually convinced, and it was a great time seeing old friends and networking to make new ones. I mentioned Facebook earlier because during this time when it was new and restricted to college students only and not ruining the country, it gave us a way to put faces to names and communicate with each other in a way that email just couldn't do, and made keeping contact with each other a lot easier. This whole trip to OSU really started to plant the seeds for something special. It was different than just going to a conference at a host school and just hanging out with the people you came with. It was 4 schools working toward a common purpose. When the actual MAFA conference came around that year, there was a much bigger effort to try and get people out of their comfort zones in a situation that only happens a few times a year. As a quick aside, it wasn't just these schools starting to work on branching out. FIA at UIC's Battle of the Bamboo was in its infancy. Back then, it wasn't the auditorium hotel filling juggernaut it is now. It started small, like all things do. The first one U of I went to was in a food court. So they didn't have a huge interstate presence yet. But they were doing a great job of bringing together the Chicago area schools in the name of competition. So a year later, 2006, for the 10th anniversary of MAFA, the conference was returning to where it began at Marquette. While there, I went with U of I, and we befriended two guys who had come from the University of Washington. They were just doing research on what other conferences were out there, found MAFA, and flew out for it. They were shocked that there were so many Filipinos in Wisconsin and around the Midwest. That's not surprising. That's kind of every West or East Coast Filipinos' reactions. What was surprising is they wanted us to see their version of MAFA, the Northwest Filipino American Student Alliance Conference, or NWFASA, at Portland State University. Of course, this is before Zoom or YouTube, so they asked the MAFA coordinators and the exec board of PSEA at Illinois, can we fly you out to Seattle? Of course, we took them up on it. We flew out to Seattle, met a bunch of people there, and road tripped with them to Portland for the conference. And I still have actually the t-shirt. It's kind of faded now, but that's FASA at the UW. So I got the club t-shirt. It's kind of nice. At this time, I had heard of FIND, which is the Filipino Intercollegiate Networking Dialogue. So FIND is basically the East Coast Filipino student umbrella organization. At that point, I hadn't been to one of their conferences. They have conferences just like MAFA, etc. But Purdue had gone out there. They did exactly what those Washington students did, found out what other Philams were doing across the country, and went to see it with their own eyes. Now, here I was on the other side of the country doing the same thing. Sure, this was a conference like Factor MAFA, but I also got to hear about how the exec boards in the Pacific Northwest would come together periodically to discuss common goals or plan events together. Naturally, the question became, why can't we in the Midwest do this? Our local Philam communities might not have the history or the numbers of people you'd find in LA or New York, but they've been growing. And while our huge distances from each other was definitely a hurdle we'd have to overcome, there was still a sense of commonality. For example, look up Filipino American history classes. They're all West Coast, East Coast, or Hawaii. Outside of family parties, I didn't really have a sense of Filipino identity growing up, which I feel is common outside of the big cities of the Midwest. There's some shared struggle here. I couldn't let the gift from UW go to waste, so I had to strike while the iron was hot, which meant pulling a few strings. I graduated in spring of 2006, but I asked that fall's FACT coordinators to give me a workshop slot. It would go through lunch, so they needed to budget some food for us, and I wanted every president and vice president who registered for FACT to be forced into that workshop. Oh, and I also asked FACT to fly out the former president of Washington's FASA, and I brought down UIC's former president. So I did ask a lot. But we presented the first conference within a conference that year, or CWAC, QUEC, a workshop that lives on to this day. Fun trivia, that name came from a grade school program I was in called School Within a School, which is gone, but the legacy of SWAS lives on in QUEC. So part of that workshop was reflecting on the realities of being a Filipino American student organization. In 4-ish years, the org has to reach out to someone who potentially barely identifies as Filipino, educate them, give them the skills to be a leader, then watch them leave as the cycle continues. We talked about wanting to make an impact in our local communities and abroad, having a cultural basis to set us apart from general Asian groups, and other common problems and situations our organizations shared. But we made sure to highlight that we could help each other. Some groups only had a few people, some were massive. Some were only a year or two old, some had decades behind them. We just had to start thinking of ourselves as a community. From there, we explained how Washington and groups in that Northwest region would make long drives just to be in a space where they could strategize and plan events. How Find covers as much, if not more, distance than the Midwest would. It goes from Florida all the way up to New England. My goal was to convince everyone in that room that there were needs to be addressed, and we had examples to follow, but the planning had to begin now with them. There's no parent organization to report to, nor any history to coast on. At the end of the workshop, I collected these slips here. So here's the folder from that year's fact. I have a bunch of these slips. They have people's and organizations' contact info. So among those represented, Kapwa at Loyola, FASO at Notre Dame, Kaibigan at Northwestern. There's a lot of representation and history in this stack. The best part of these slips is I asked for people's AOL Instant Messenger screen names, which I'm sure none of you ever had. From there, I set up a Google mailing list with all these contacts so we'd stay connected, then built a contact spreadsheet and a simple website. A few months later, I reached out to the Marquette MAFA chords, who we went to Seattle with, and asked them if it'd be okay if we used the MAFA name for this new collective. They agreed, and everything quack became MAFA. At this point, it's not really my story to tell. My whole goal was to convince everyone that this is possible and get the ball rolling. And a couple years later, the first official MAFA executive board with current students would be formed. Now, this wasn't a community I created out of thin air. It was a combination of recognizing a need, understanding we had the resources and potential, and a bit of good luck and timing. We had about 14 schools represented there at the first quack, and now MAFA has double that many member schools, thanks to the work that first board and group put in. When I was about to graduate college, even though I had spent so much time and energy on PSA and MAFA after it, I didn't really know what else was out there in the real world. PSA was my first exposure to a Filipino American community that I felt a part of. Things are different now, so I hope that you all have an idea of what's going on out there, especially if you're graduating soon. Throughout this weekend, if there's a speaker or group who really inspires you, reach out to them and see if you can get involved in their cause. But I did want to spend some time to shout out some organizations, at least in the Chicago area, that would love to have your energy and insights. So there's a youth-led group that originated in the Philippines fighting for national democracy, Anagbayan, to help fight for racial equity, Asian Americans Advancing Justice. For anyone interested in law, they're the Filipino American Lawyers Association. For preserving and spreading Philam history, there's FANHS, FANHS, or the Filipino American National Historical Society. They're also the ones who literally they deemed that October would be Filipino American History Month. So we have that group to thank for that. For creating projects to advance the relationships between the US and the Philippines, including going abroad to make those projects a reality, it's PhilPro. Another group that started in the Philippines, fighting for the liberation of oppressed Filipino women, Gabriela. There's a group for civic and national affairs, and anyone looking to get into politics. There's NAFA, NAFFAA, or the National Federation of Filipino American Associations. And I have to shout out this group. They're striving for a more unified and engaged Filipino America through action, leadership, development, and advocacy. Filipino American Unity for Progress, UniPro. I am on the board of directors for it, so I am a bit biased. I know I missed a lot of other great orgs. And what I just told you all, they were just some quick one-liners, so I didn't get anyone's full mission statement across. But I've always wanted to stress that community work doesn't have to stop just because you finished college. Now, your responsibilities will definitely multiply really quickly. There's fighting and holding down a job, maybe thinking about settling down, and just general adulting is a lot to process. And even I've had to take a few breaks from community work here and there. Self care is always important, but there's also always work to be done, especially as these past couple years have shown. The post conference buzz might be a little different with everything virtual, but I urge all of you to share anything you learn or feel this weekend with your friends and family. Within a week at most. Holidays are right around the corner, and you don't want to lose all this good momentum. Communication is really what leads to community, and who knows from where inspiration might strike. Thank you all, and have a great fact.
2, 1.
Thank you so much, Ryne. That was an amazing speech. And sorry again for those technical difficulties. Thank you for picking that up right after that happened. But now we're going to open up the floor for some questions anyone here may have. So please use the chat to put any questions you have for Ryne, whether it's for MAFA or his time here at U of I too. So anything at all, we'll try to get to your questions. But for now, we have a few questions for ourselves. So take it away, Abby.
So did you face any hardships in leadership in any of position that you were in, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, the biggest issues you'll find with leadership, it doesn't really apply so much to college groups, I found, but it definitely manifests itself in its own way, I should say, is burnout. I didn't address it at all in what I said, but it takes a lot out of you doing community work. It's a lot of mental, emotional, sometimes physical. Like for me personally, I was a part of a website called bucketY.com for a bit, and there's one point where I was like driving 6 hours to Ohio State, and my body was just like, you know what, we need to take a break from this. And it happens to everyone, and it's the constant struggle for a lot of these organizations that I mentioned. So it's not something that I've faced, and I don't have a great answer for how to fix it. That could be a whole workshop in it of itself. But it's always good to be cognizant that it's something that's going to affect everybody. I've seen chapters of other groups come and go. I've seen student groups come and go. And it's always a tricky thing to balance. So I still face that today with some of the groups I'm involved with, but it's something to definitely be aware of and try to manage.
Yeah. Personally, when you do face burnout, what is your way to de-stress, and what do you do to take your mind off of things?
Yeah. So where I am now, that's a good question. How do I manage my own burnout? It's just taking breaks, making sure you have a good core of people that you can depend on, and once you have that confidence and you know that, okay, if I take a break, things are going to fall apart. And other people can kind of pick up the slack, and then you can do the same when it's kind of your turn to do that. It's about taking care of yourself, because it could get to the point where you burn out and you don't want anything to do at all with the community. Like, you know what, I want to focus on my work and life, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's also, if you want to stay engaged, you kind of have to check yourself every once in a while to make sure you're not going down a swirling toilet and getting stuck there.
Right.
And how did you start becoming involved in your community and obtaining leadership positions?
So kind of like I mentioned, PSEA was really the first Filipino group or community I really felt a part of. When I went to high school in the Chicago suburbs, and there were Filipinos there, but I didn't hang out with them much. But I kind of made the concerted effort when I knew I was going to go to U of I. I'm like, I've heard about PSEA, and just in general, I want to get to know this part of me that I was never really aware of. And I really fell in love with it, and I kind of poured everything I had into it, probably a little too much. But hey, I graduated, so whatever. But yeah, from there, it's just I saw things that I wanted to fix as part of that group. And so I made those changes. And then with MAFA, like I just mentioned, I saw a gap and I wanted to fill that gap. And that's kind of how all my other projects from there have been. It's, hey, there's potential here. All we need is just to kind of put our heads together and work together.
Gotcha. Thanks. We have a question in the chat from actually our fact cords. So they say, since we are reaching the second and third generations of Phil-Ams following the mass migration of Filipinos during the 90s, how do you suggest keeping up with Phil-Am engagement if people feel disconnected from the culture?
So I guess, so in fact, I think who would they be asking this about? Like current students or people who are older? I guess that's kind of hard because you're reading a question.
I guess current students. I think a big topic that I guess we all, like us here as students, have talked with each other is about like how close we feel to our Filipino identity, and now that some of us are first generation, but some of us are second or third generation from when our first relatives came to the United States. How do you suggest to keep up that relationship with our identity and sticking to our roots?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. It's kind of funny. You said mass migration in the 90s. Like, I guess I'm older than that. But it's something that I've heard in other workshops before and other people advocate for. It's talking about your histories and not necessarily like, Filipino history, Filipino American history, which is important, but your family's history, right? Like, maybe your parents didn't come over from the Philippines, but maybe your grandparents did, or some other relative. And it's kind of a weird thing because like you don't really talk about that kind of stuff when you're with your family, right? You're just kind of catching up and like eating food. But it's worth it to really make the effort to understand what they went through and how things were, how they had to adapt to come to this country. So right now, actually, like my wife is pregnant with our first kid, and I'm super excited.
Congrats.
Thank you. And for me, it's like I need to make sure that this kid knows where they came from, and they don't take any of this for granted. And so it's a lot of just sharing history, and that's kind of what I try to do with my speech a little bit today. But I think once you get that understanding, then the interest grows and the understanding grows, and then things just flow from there.
Good answer. Thank you.
Thank you for the insight. It was really nice.
Yeah. We have one more question.
From Gabe. What would you say is something Phil-Am student orgs should focus on in this current moment of history? I'm sure the needs and focuses of student orgs have changed exponentially since your time at U of I.
Yeah, I mean, when I was back there, social media was just growing. It was just a thing. It wasn't even called social media back then. It was just Facebook, and then MySpace was kind of dying. It's really hard for me to comment about what to do in the time of COVID. This is something, it's been over a year, but there's no way I can understand what you all are going through, and it stinks. And I don't, no matter how old you are, you're processing it at your stage of life you're at. So I can't really say to that exactly what to do, but I'm definitely open to talking it out or working through it. If that's, if it's something that we need to talk about as a larger group. But there's so much, even though I guess everything was shut down and maybe things are opening up a little bit, but there's so much technology out there and sharing of things that we didn't have back then, right? So many Instagram accounts or TikTok accounts, or I don't know, anything else out there. And, leveraging those while we have to, and staying up to date, and again, sharing and communicating with other people and spreading that. If you have to talk over Zoom meetings or emails, so be it. But just making sure that communication doesn't die out, I think is really important in this time.
Thank you. Yeah, so That was really good answers and equally amazing speech. That is unfortunately all the time we have for tonight, but we want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us and answering all the questions tonight. We really enjoyed having you. Before saying bye, do you have any closing remarks for our audience?
Just stay safe, treat each other well, and again, have a great fact. And again, if you learn or hear anything that really resonates with you, there's so much stuff in life coming up. There's like Thanksgiving, there's holidays, there's probably exams, there's non-conference life waiting for you, but try to just share all that and get it out of your system into the world before you kind of have to focus in again on that stuff.
Perfect.
Wow. Thank you so much for the advice. And thank you again for being here. We look forward to seeing you and working with you again in the future.
Thank you, Ryne.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
Ryne. Give a
round of applause.
round of applause.
All right.